I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. A respected forensic pathologist has recently expressed his opinion in several areas on the scenario we've been presented with in the Morphew case, bones scattered out in the open in a Colorado field. It's something that we don't see very often in true crime. So, in terms of that, where is the investigation headed now? What are the investigators doing right now in terms of this new evidence? Well, one of the key areas now is to try to find the cause of death. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind I'll be doing a series dealing with various elements of this case, but within the context of this new perspective. So if you're interested in that, please subscribe. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, unless disrupted by animals, this is a quote from Baden, this pathologist. He says, unless disrupted by animals, the desert conditions where Suzanne Morphew's remains were found in Moffat, these dry conditions very likely preserved her bones and other potential evidence related to her death. And so this is what he said. This chief medical examiner for New York City, this is what he told Fox News Digital. He said, the skeleton should be intact. So if there's any kind of injury like a gunshot wound or a stabbing, cutting, or being hit in the head, some kind of blunt force trauma, the bone should still be intact enough to make that diagnosis. Now, some of what Baden says is interesting. It does make sense, but not this, as far as I'm concerned. He seems not to have been paying very close attention. 6 days ago, authorities did say that the bones had been buried in a shallow grave before being scattered. And so clearly her skeleton isn't intact. And I do think it is interference by animals, and I do think that this could cloud and confuse the true nature of what happened to poor Suzanne. Baden also said that strangulation is a common cause of death among women found deceased and alone like Suzanne Morphew. That's true. That is true. But I have my doubts the hyoid bone, which is the critical cartilage structure, it's a critical structure that will indicate whether manual strangulation did take place. But, it needs to be found intact, and I think it'll probably not be intact. I think if animals had their way with the remains, then I don't think it is going to be intact. And bear in mind, there are probably they're minimal tissues that remained, and I don't think any DNA was actually recovered from the scene, which is why they had to use dental records and that can support. And when you're dealing with something like a hyoid bone, that is the sort of structure that it's not strictly speaking bone. It's a softer, more flexible kind of structure that's kind of like cartilage. And that's the sort of thing that an animal might actually consume. So I have my doubts that something like that is going to be recovered. The Saywatch County coroner is likely performing x-rays of Morphew's remains, according to Baden, and he says that this would be done to find evidence like a bullet in her body. And the impression I get is he's imagining kind of like a complete skeleton, and that is not what I think is the case here. I do think they might be performing x-rays of some of what they've got, but they are apparently also examining the crime scene to see if they can find any other evidence. And according to the article, they may be looking for bullets, cigarette butts, bottle caps that may contain DNA, etc. Now, this is a possibility, and in my view, it's a likely reason for the second search. There may also be, it may also be that during the autopsy, the coroner noticed something like a potential bullet wound. And so if you've seen that in the bones or in some of these structures, then you would want to look for something like the original bullet. That is the sort of artifact that will be left, in other words, recorded in the bone, especially if it was into the skull. And you remember in the Brian Laundrie case, that's exactly what we had in that case, despite the fact that we had skeletal remains. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if they were back in the field searching for something like a bullet, but I can't say I saw anyone using a metal detector. Now, one of the ways you can look for a bullet is you can go through a lot of soil, and you can put the soil into a sieve and then see what sort of things come out of that. We do know investigators arrived at the scene early Friday morning and remained in situ until late in the afternoon. Baden also said if the body was in a grave, obviously it indicates that somebody did it. In other words, that somebody put her there. Well, yes, of course. If a bullet is recovered, it can then potentially be matched to a particular type of firearm. Does Barry have that firearm? That would be the next step. And this could be inculpatory, or for that matter, exculpatory. We know a .40 caliber unspent round with extraction marks was found near the girls' bodies. That's in the Delphi case. And apparently, let's say allegedly, matched to Richard Allen's Sig Sauer firearm. So we could have a similar scenario to that happening here. Now, if Barry Morphew was wearing clothing at the time, that's another interesting point that Baden said. He said, well, if the clothing is there, the clothing could still be intact. Her clothing could also contain information such as gunshot residue or even blood traces. And that would then indicate signs of a struggle. Now, that is a pretty good point. The clothing. Clothing may well contain evidence. I really can't imagine that her remains could have been, she could have had a change of clothing, of post-mortem. The clothing could present very interesting twist in this case. It can indicate the time and circumstances of Suzanne's death. We saw a scenario something like this in the Shanann Watts case, where we saw that she'd changed her T-shirt. Now, one reason to doubt a gunshot wound is that neighbors didn't report hearing any gunshots. Of course, in the Letitia Storr case, no gunshots were heard by neighbors either, and yet, according to the autopsy, there was a single gunshot. I do think if authorities end up recovering clothing seen in Suzanne's last photo, if the clothing, if they do find clothing, and if that clothing is a match to what is seen in Suzanne's last photo, then Barry might have some serious explaining to do. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.